And it says here, and it came about, verse 10, as she spoke to Joseph day after day. God allowed the temptation to be persistent, not just once, again and again and again and again. And he did not listen. God was testing this man. He did not listen. And he wouldn't even be with her. He avoided temptation and fled away. Now it happened, verse 11, one day that when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled. He did what Paul exhorted Timothy: flee youthful lusts. He just ran. It didn't matter if he lost his garment. Better to lose his garment than to lose a good conscience. And he fled. It's a tremendous example for all young people. If you want to know why God honored Joseph, you see the example here. He submitted to authority. He kept himself pure. And there is an example, there is a type of Jesus who submitted to authority and kept himself pure. Those are the only two things we know about Jesus 30 years in Nazareth. Two things. He submitted to authority and he kept himself pure. That's the best training for all young people to minister in the body of Christ. To submit to authority and to keep yourself pure. And he ran. He knew that there were passions in his body. If he stayed around there, he'd be tempted beyond his ability, so he ran. And that's the right thing to do when we find ourselves in situations where we will be tempted beyond our ability, to just leave whatever we have to leave and run and not expose ourselves. And then the training continues. The next part of Joseph's training is tested as a servant, tested with brothers who were jealous. We saw that in the previous chapter 37. Tested in the area of purity. And now he has to be tested in another area, and that is the area of false accusation. When she saw, verse 13, that he had left his garment and fled, she called the men of her household and said, "See, my husband has brought in a Hebrew to us and makes sport of us. He came to lie with me and I screamed. And when he heard that I raised my voice, he left his garment and went outside. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home." She obviously didn't have a good relationship with her husband. And that's why she was after Joseph. And look at the way she talks about her husband here. Pathetic if any wife ever talks like this about her husband to other people. "See the type of servant my husband has brought to work in my house." Verse 14. Pretty clear they had a poor relationship. And when Potiphar came back, she told him the same words: "Accuse Joseph falsely." And I have a feeling that Potiphar didn't really believe it, because he knew Joseph. He must have seen something in Joseph. But he had to do something to appease his wife. So he puts Joseph in jail. If he really believed it, he'd have killed him. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for Pharaoh's bodyguard captain to just finish off his slave. Nobody would have asked any questions. But he didn't believe it. But to appease his wife, he put him in jail, and Joseph never says a word. He just keeps quiet. He just humbles himself under that false accusation. And it says here, Joseph's master, verse 20, took him and put him in the jail. I mentioned some time ago the story of a German saint who lived 5-6 centuries ago called Henry Suso. A very saintly single man who lived in a little house down a street and who prayed and said, "Lord, make me like Jesus." And one day he heard a knock on the door of his house, and there was a woman standing there with a little baby in her arm, dumped the baby into his hands and said, "Here is the fruit of your sin," shouted it loud enough for people on the street to hear, and ran away. He had never seen that woman before. She was just trying to get rid of an unwanted baby and thought that this saintly man down at the end of the road is the best person to dump it on. And all the people down the street heard it. And they began to talk. Oh, so this is what this so-called saintly man has been up to. And the woman disappeared. And Henry Suso took that little baby and closed the door and knelt down inside and said, Lord, nobody down the street will believe me, but you know I'm innocent. What shall I do? And the Lord spoke to him and said, do what I did. Suffer for the sins of others. This is somebody else's sin. You are to suffer for it. You prayed some time ago, make me like Jesus. Well, now you can learn a little bit of that. And he accepted it. You say, why doesn't God test us like that? Well, I'll tell you why. This is postgraduate stuff, brothers. We are struggling in first standard and second standard. God can't give us such tests. Certainly not. Small little mosquito bites and we complain. Where can God give us postgraduate examinations? God perhaps could have tested us at that level too if we hadn't complained about the little kindergarten tests that we get. But God could entrust. God does not test us beyond our ability. He did not test Henry Suso beyond his ability. His ability was much more. And he couldn't explain the New and Living Way like we can, I'll tell you that. But he walked it. And there was a saintly man, and he brought up that child just like his own, as if it were his own. And was scandalized in that town. People misunderstood him, told all types of stories about him, and he never opened his mouth. He had prayed that he wanted to be like Jesus, and God did a work of humbling himself, making him lose his reputation. I'll tell you this, my brothers and sisters, to lose our reputation for spirituality is really a postgraduate test. I don't think many believers are capable of standing it. Many believers are willing to lose everything else, but not their reputation for spirituality. But Henry Suso was willing even for that. Jesus was willing. He had no reputation. Many years later, the woman came back to the same street and proclaimed, convicted by her sin, proclaimed the innocence of Henry Suso. What a man. But by the time the woman proclaimed it, God had already done His work in the heart of Henry Suso, and he had passed the test. Yeah, these are some of the men we are going to meet in eternity. Men who gave up everything, who didn't live on a doctrine, but who really sought to follow the Lord. Joseph, Henry Suso, who knew how to keep quiet when falsely accused, lived in purity. That's a test. And they put him in jail, but you couldn't separate the Lord from Joseph. Whether you put him in Potiphar's house or in jail, the Lord is with Joseph. It says here in verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. And the chief jailer began to see that the Lord was with him, because verse 23, the Lord was with him. The Lord made him to prosper. He's an amazing man, Joseph. You put him in charge of the sheep in his father's sheep, he prospers there. You put him as a slave in Potiphar's house, he'll prosper there. You put him in jail with a false accusation and he'll prosper there. You can't push down. It's like cork, you know. You can't push cork underwater. It just keeps coming up. You push it down, it'll come up again. If you humble yourself and you're pure and you live with a good conscience before God, false accusation, all types of things, it can't suppress you. The Lord will be with you and He'll make you surface. However much people try to push you down, you'll surface. That is the answer. What a testimony. Even in jail. And when we talk about jails, remember those days, jails were not like today's nice jails where food is served on time, and they were dungeons in those days with rats and insects and vermin creeping all over and filthy place. And there the Lord was with him. It was part of his education to be a man of God. This was the Bible school. This is the Bible school which God gives His people. Submission to authority, false accusation, temptation. And you come through that Bible school, you have far more understanding of God and His Word than all these wretched Bible schools that just cram people's heads with knowledge today.